Evening shadows stretched across the capital as the call of vendors echoed through the crowded streets. Ibrahim's convoy slowed near a market corner where life seemed ordinary: children, laughing merchants, bargaining, the smell of fried dough drifting in the air. But then his eyes caught a figure most would ignore: an elderly man, frail and forgotten, staring blankly at the ground. A strange pull tightened Ibrahim's chest. Little did he know this encounter would awaken memories buried for 3 long decades. The car door clicked open as Ibrahim stepped out, dust swirling around his boots. His guards exchanged uneasy glances but stayed back. Something in his stride told them not to interfere. The market noise faded in his ears as he walked closer to the old man slumped against the cracked wall. The man's hands trembled as he clutched a rusted tin cup. A few coins rattled inside, not enough for a meal. Passers-by walked past as if he were invisible. Some whispered cruel words, another beggar wasting away. Others simply turned their heads. Ibrahim's chest tightened. There was something hauntingly familiar about the curve of those shoulders, the tired yet stubborn tilt of the chin. He slowed, searching the man's face until a memory struck like lightning. The man's eyes lifted, dull at first, then widening in disbelief. His lips quivered. Ibrahim. The voice cracked, fragile like old wood breaking. Ibrahim froze. His throat clenched. That name, spoken with such trembling tenderness, came not from a stranger, but from the man who had once lifted him as a boy, the one who had given him shelter when no one else would. His adoptive father. The years had carved deep lines into the man's face, stealing his strength, but not his essence. Ibrahim's vision blurred. For a heartbeat, he was no longer a leader standing in a dusty street. He was a child again, barefoot, looking up at the man who had once called him son. Father. Ibrahim's voice broke. He dropped into one knee, ignoring the gasps of the crowd. It's you. After all these years. The old man reached out, his fingers shaking. When they touched Ibrahim's hand, his body shuddered with silent sobs. 30 years. I thought I'd lost you forever. Around them, the market went still. Phones rose, recording the scene. Some eyes welled with tears, others widened in shock. Few could comprehend what they were witnessing: a president kneeling before a beggar calling him father. Ibrahim leaned closer, his voice firm yet tender. No more, father. You will not suffer alone again. I promise you that. The old man clung to him, tears streaking through the dust on his cheeks. The years of pain had not erased their bond. In that fragile embrace, the past and present fused into one heartbeat, one vow. Before we continue with this heartbreaking story, I'd love to know, where are you watching this video from, and what time is it there? Comment below. I can't wait to read your answers. They sat together in the quiet of the presidential residence. Later that evening, the old man, wrapped in clean clothes, a warm bowl of soup trembling in his hands. His eyes darted around the room, unsure if he belonged in such a place. Ibrahim leaned forward, his voice soft. Father, tell me what happened. Where have you been all these years? The old man's spoon clattered against the bowl. His lips pressed together before a deep sigh escaped. It's a story I never thought I would live to tell. He began with the years of honest work as a teacher, pouring his heart into children who had no books, no pencils, yet left his classroom with hope. He spoke of the day his health faltered when the school board replaced him with someone younger, leaving him with no pension. At first, he thought it was temporary, but days turned into months, and the wages never came. I went to the offices, he whispered, eyes clouded. They said my papers were missing. That without proof, I could not receive what I had earned. Proof I had given 30 years of my life, and they asked for proof. His voice cracked with bitterness. Ibrahim's fists clenched, nails biting into his palms. The man went on how his wife, weary from poverty, had left. How his children turned away, ashamed of a father who could no longer provide. How friends closed their doors one by one. I wandered from place to place, he said. Sometimes I worked for scraps. Sometimes I begged. Each year I grew weaker, and each year I thought of you. His eyes glistened, fixed on Ibrahim. Do you remember the alphabet? The first time you wrote your name? Ibrahim's throat tightened. I do. The old man's voice trembled, yet carried the weight of truth. I taught you the letter A with chalk I borrowed. You gripped it so tightly, afraid it would vanish. And now his words broke into sobs. Now I beg for crumbs. The same hand that once taught is stretched out for cold leftovers. The sentence sliced through the air like a blade, and Ibrahim felt it deep in his chest. The mighty leader, the commander of armies, bowed his head, tears burning his eyes. For a moment, he was not a president, but a son crushed by the sight of his father's suffering. Memories flooded back, the rough but steady hands guiding his own the evenings when his father went hungry so that he could eat, the voice that whispered, "One day you will rise higher than the stars, but never forget those who lifted you." Now that same man sat broken before him. I survived by clinging to one thing, the old man said, his voice a rasp. The belief that maybe, just maybe, I would see you again. Ibrahim reached across the table, gripping his father's hand with fierce tenderness. You are not forgotten. Not by me. Not ever. The room fell silent, save for the sound of quiet sobbing. Staff members standing at the doorway wiped their own tears. For Ibrahim, the pain of the past 30 years had been laid bare. Yet within the grief, a fire ignited. He would not let his father fade into dust. He would fight not only for him, but for every forgotten elder cast aside by a system without mercy. The old man's voice dropped to a whisper. I thought my story was ending. Ibrahim shook his head firmly. No, father. Tonight your story begins again. The next morning, the sun rose hot and merciless over the city, but Ibrahim's heart burned hotter. He had made up his mind. His father would not live another day in despair. When the old man tried to protest, saying he didn't belong in palaces or cars, Ibrahim silenced him with a single steady sentence. Father, you once carried me when I could not walk. Now it is my turn. He bent down, lifting his frail body into his arms. Gasps spread through the courtyard. Guards hesitated, unsure whether to intervene, but Ibrahim's command was silent, absolute. He strode past them, holding the man as though he weighed nothing. At the gates, a security officer stepped forward nervously. Excellency, it isn't proper. Ibrahim's voice cracked like thunder. Stand aside. The officer froze, lowering his eyes. Crowds had begun to gather, phones, raised whispers flooding the street. Some muttered in disbelief, others wiped at their eyes. The president, carrying a beggar, one woman said, her voice trembling. Another answered softly, not a beggar. His father. Inside the car, the old man wept silently, his tears falling onto Ibrahim's sleeve. Why? Why would you do this for me? Ibrahim's eyes burned, but his voice was calm and firm. Because you never abandoned me, even when you had nothing. And now the world will see no man who gives love should ever be left to die in the dust. The convoy rolled forward, sirens silent, but hearts loud. On sidewalks, People pointed, some knelt in respect. Others clapped spontaneously. The image was raw, unforgettable. A leader cradling a forgotten man, rewriting what dignity meant in a single act. At the hospital, chaos erupted as staff rushed forward. Nurses whispered, recognizing Ibrahim, but their eyes kept darting to the trembling figure in his arms. A doctor stammered, "Sir, please, we have procedures." Ibrahim cut him off with steel in his tone. "Your procedure now is to heal him. Start immediately. I will take full responsibility." No one argued after that. As his father was placed gently on a bed, Ibrahim stood at his side, refusing to leave. Machines hummed, IV bags filled, and the old man's breathing began to steady. Leaning close, Ibrahim whispered words that made the nurses pause, their own throats tightening. "You once told me, strength is not in fists, but in the hand that lifts another. Today, Father, I lift you, and I will not let go." For the first time in decades, hope flickered in the old man's eyes. He reached weakly for his son's hand. "You were always my greatest lesson." And in that sterile room, filled with blinking lights and hushed footsteps, Ibrahim's vow became unshakable. Whatever walls stood in the way, corruption, indifference, injustice, he would tear them down. Because this was no longer just about one man. It was about a nation learning that compassion was power. News spread faster than fire in dry grass. By afternoon, every radio station, every street corner, every market stall in Ouagadougou buzzed with the same story. The president had carried an old beggar into the hospital, calling him father. But while the people cheered, the system pushed back. Inside the Ministry of Social Affairs, officials sat around a long table, paper stacked, high faces tense. They spoke in rehearsed tones about protocols, eligibility, and budgetary limits. To them, the old man was not a father, not a teacher, not even a citizen in need. He was a case file, a burden. One officer adjusted his glasses. "Excellency, we have investigated. The man lacks complete documentation. Without proof of service, his pension cannot be restored." Ibrahim's eyes narrowed. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a storm. He gave 30 years of his life teaching children to read and write. And you dare tell me his service does not exist because of missing paper? The room stiffened. Another official cleared his throat. "Sir, if we make an exception for one, others will demand the same. It would be chaos." Ibrahim slammed his palm on the table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Chaos. Chaos is when a nation abandons those who built its future. Chaos is when a teacher starves in the street while thieves dine in palaces. That is the shame you defend with your papers. Gasps rippled through the hall. Some officials shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at their notes, avoiding his gaze. One man, bolder than the rest, muttered, "With respect, Excellency, this matter does not deserve your personal involvement. He is only one man." Ibrahim stood his chair, scraping harshly against the floor. His voice thundered, "Only one man. That man is my father. That man represents every forgotten elder in this land. If we abandon even one, we have failed them all." Silence crashed down. No one dared breathe. He pointed to the stack of documents. "If the papers are lost, then write new ones. If the system blocks him, then I will break the system. From this moment, he receives full medical care, a pension, and the honor he earned, and I will sign it myself." An aide rushed forward with a folder. Ibrahim seized the pen and signed with bold strokes, each line a defiance against indifference. The officials stared in stunned disbelief. Some whispered about costs, about precedent, about rules. But others, young clerks, junior staff, looked at him with something different in their eyes' hope. That evening, word of his declaration spread. Crowds gathered outside the hospital chanting his name. Some carried banners that read, "No teacher forgotten." Mothers wept openly. Fathers raised their fists in solidarity. Students past and present spoke of the man who had once given them letters and light. Inside, Ibrahim sat at his father's bedside, holding his hand. The old man's eyes fluttered open. "You shouldn't fight for me," he whispered weakly. "It is too much." Ibrahim shook his head. "Not for you alone, Father. For everyone like you. For every voice silenced by papers and corruption. Tonight we begin a war not with weapons, but with dignity." The old man's lips trembled into a faint smile. "Then you are the son I always believed you would be." And in that moment, Ibrahim knew the battle was no longer just about saving a father. It was about tearing down a wall of injustice so high it had hidden thousands. Now the wall had cracks, and through those cracks, light was beginning to pour. The days that followed were heavy with tension, but inside the hospital, something remarkable began to unfold. The old man, once frail and abandoned, now lay in a clean bed surrounded by doctors and nurses who tended to him with quiet urgency. For the first time in decades, he was treated not as a burden, but as someone who mattered. His breathing grew steadier. His eyes, once clouded with despair, began to clear. Ibrahim came every day. He sat by the bedside, reading reports with one hand and holding his father's hand with the other. Cameras flashed whenever he entered, but he never cared about optics. This was not politics. This was family. One afternoon, as golden light poured through the hospital windows, the old man stirred. Slowly, he opened his eyes and saw Ibrahim beside him. A faint smile broke through the wrinkles. "You're still here," he whispered. "I will always be here." Ibrahim answered, his voice steady. Tears welled up in the old man's eyes. "I thought I had lost everything. My home, my dignity, my family. But I was wrong. I did not lose you." Ibrahim's throat tightened, but he held back his tears. Instead, he bowed his head and murmured words that made every nurse in the room pause. "Thank you, Father, for never giving up on me. Today, I thank you for still believing I am your son." The old man's chest shuddered with emotion. He reached up trembling and touched Ibrahim's cheek. "You were always my son. Nothing, not distance, not poverty, not 30 years could erase that." In that moment, the room fell silent. Staff exchanged glances, their eyes glistening. Some discreetly wiped their faces. For them, this was no longer just a medical case. It was a living testament to love, resilience, and gratitude. Later that evening, Ibrahim stood with hospital staff and local citizens who had gathered outside. His voice carried into the crowd, raw yet firm. "Look at him," he said, gesturing toward the ward. "He is not just my father. He is a teacher who gave light to countless children. He is a reminder that no life should ever be discarded. And I say to you, no elder in our land will be left to die in silence again." Applause broke out, rolling like thunder. Some shouted his name. Others wept openly. The people felt as if their own forgotten parents and grandparents were being lifted in that very moment. Back inside, Ibrahim returned to the bedside. The old man squeezed his hand stronger than before. His eyes gleamed, no longer dim. "You've given me back my life," he whispered. Ibrahim shook his head softly. "No, Father. You gave me life first. I am only giving it back." And in that quiet exchange, something more than survival had taken place. It was a resurrection, not only of a man, but of hope itself. The miracle was not just in medicine or power, but in love that endured through the years. A love that once rekindled could heal both a family and a nation. Just as peace seemed to return, another storm appeared. One late afternoon, as Ibrahim visited his father in the hospital garden, a shadow approached hesitantly. A woman, her clothes worn, her eyes heavy with regret. The old man froze, his lips parted, trembling. It was his former wife, the woman who had left him when poverty stripped away his dignity. She lowered her gaze, voice breaking. "Ibrahim." "Sir, I didn't come for power or money. I came because I have nothing left. The man I followed abandoned me. My home is gone. My health is failing. Please, forgive me." The air grew tense. Nurses exchanged uneasy glances. The old man's hand shook as he clutched the armrest of his chair. "You left me," he whispered. "When I was weakest, you turned away." Her tears fell freely. "I was wrong, blinded by fear. Please, even if you cannot take me back, let me stay near. I have nowhere else." Ibrahim watched silently, the weight of decades pressing on the moment. He turned to his father, letting him decide. The old man's chest rose and fell as he battled between bitterness and compassion. Finally, his voice came soft but steady. "I cannot walk the same road with you again, but I do not wish for you to starve. You may stay, but not as wife, only as someone I once knew." She bowed her head, sobbing. "That is more mercy than I deserve." Ibrahim stepped closer, his tone firm. "This nation is learning that no one should be abandoned to hunger, but mercy does not erase betrayal. You will be given food, shelter, and care, not because of what you did, but because we choose compassion over cruelty." The woman wept harder, while the crowd that had gathered nodded in solemn agreement. Later, as Ibrahim and his father sat alone, the old man whispered, "You taught me something today, son. Sometimes the greatest justice is not revenge, but showing mercy without surrendering dignity." Ibrahim squeezed his hand gently. "And sometimes, Father, a nation heals when its people learn to forgive without forgetting." The garden grew quiet again, but the lesson lingered in every heart that had witnessed it. Weeks later, the story of Ibrahim and his long-lost father had traveled far beyond Burkina Faso. Newspapers across Africa carried the headline, "A President Who Kneels Before His Father." On social media, clips of Ibrahim lifting the old man into his arms went viral, watched millions of times, sparking conversations about dignity, family, and forgotten elders. But for Ibrahim, the real work was not in headlines. It was in change. One bright morning, he returned to the hospital to find his father dressed stronger, his eyes shining with new life. Together they walked to a small community hall where dozens of children waited, notebooks in hand. Ibrahim placed chalk into his father's palm. "You once gave me letters," Ibrahim said. "Now give them to the next generation." The old man's hand trembled, but when he turned to the blackboard, the children leaned forward, wide-eyed. With steady strokes, he wrote the alphabet, each letter reborn under his touch. The room filled with murmurs of awe. These were not just lessons, but a resurrection of a teacher's soul. Ibrahim watched quietly, his chest tight with pride. This was more than personal redemption. It was proof that no life, no matter how broken, was beyond renewal. Later, at a public gathering, Ibrahim stood before thousands. His voice rang out clear. No one in our nation should be cast aside. Not the poor, not the sick, not the old. If we have the strength to lift even one forgotten soul, we have the strength to lift all of us. My father once gave me a future when I had nothing. Today I promise every child and every elder, you will not be abandoned." The crowd roared with applause. Tears flowed freely. People lifted their hands, chanting his name not just as a leader, but as a son who remembered. Across the country, the movement grew. Community schools opened in forgotten villages. Retired teachers were sought out, given stipends, and welcomed back into classrooms. Citizens began visiting the elderly in their neighborhoods, inspired by the story of a president who carried his father home. And in the quiet of one evening, Ibrahim sat beside his father as the sun dipped low. "You see, father," he whispered, "your life is not just your own anymore. It belongs to every child who learns, every elder who has lifted every heart that still believes in love." The old man's eyes glistened. Then my story was never wasted. The sun was setting over Ouagadougou, spilling gold across the rooftops and bathing the streets in a soft glow. In the hospital courtyard, Ibrahim walked slowly with his father, their hands clasped together like they had been 30 years earlier. Each step was steady, each breath filled with the weight of the journey they had endured. Citizens gathered around the gates, silent at first, watching the two figures in the fading light. Then, like a wave, applause rose soft, then thunderous, echoing down the streets. Some shouted Ibrahim's name, others simply cried. For them, this was more than a family reunion. It was proof that compassion could break walls thicker than stone. Ibrahim paused, turning toward the crowd. His voice was not loud, yet it carried to every ear. "My friends, tonight you see not just a president and his father. You see what it means to remember. You see what it means to honor. A man who gave his life to teaching should never have been left to beg in the streets. And yet his suffering has opened our eyes. From this day forward, no elder in our land will be abandoned, no teacher forgotten, no parent left alone." The old man leaned on him, tears streaking down his weathered cheeks. "My son," he whispered, "though the crowd still heard, you have made me proud. Not because you saved me, but because you remembered me." Those words struck deeper than any speech. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Young men wiped their eyes in secret. Students who once learned from forgotten teachers vowed never to turn their backs on them again. As the sun dipped lower, Ibrahim raised his father's hand high. The image froze in the minds of all who witnessed it, a leader and a father bound not by power, but by love. In that embrace of generations, the nation saw itself scarred, struggling, but still capable of healing. The courtyard was filled with clapping laughter and tears. And in the midst of it, Ibrahim spoke one final sentence, his voice trembling with emotion. "Human kindness is the greatest legacy we can leave behind." Silence followed for a heartbeat, and then the crowd erupted once more, chanting, cheering, raising their voices into the night sky. The story would not end there. Across Africa, leaders and citizens alike would speak of the president who carried his father, who defied the system, who reminded his nation that dignity belongs to everyone. But for Ibrahim, the true victory was simpler. His father's smile, his people's hope, and the promise that compassion would outlive both crown and palace. And so, as the last light of day faded, the story of Ibrahim and his father became more than history. It became a call to action for a continent, for a people, for anyone who still believes in the power of love to change the world. If this story touched your heart, comment 1 below. If not, comment 0. And don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories of hope, dignity, and humanity.